All right, welcome to another edition of the Forecast Contest discussion. Today's lead is Professor Decker, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Decker.
All right, so let's start out by taking a look at the most recent verified forecast from October 15th for the period October 30th to November 3rd. This was a very chilly period. As you can see, the verification down here at the bottom, 92.1, and all of the forecasts were well below that normal. Interestingly, I noticed sorting by our probability skill score here, there are a lot of human forecasts at the top, and including industry number one, we have various other human forecasters, all better than climatology, and then these other approaches, whether it be moving averages, just looking at model outputs, even the consensus, the MJO analog, they were all on the it was going to be warmer than normal side of the spectrum. So I was curious to see, well, what were these human forecasters looking at? And I see a variety of different answers. I see CPC showing up in quite a few of these human forecasts. I see the EC model, although the EC did have a negative skill score. I see MJO mentioned, and at least the analog had a negative skill score, although that's a very simple way of interpreting the MJO, not looking really at the MJO forecast. Maybe it's where the MJO forecast, rather than where the MJO actually was on October 15th. That was useful information. But I didn't see any clear, there's this one signal that everyone saw that indicated at least some hint that it would be colder than the climatology based on this information here. I also was interested in seeing what actually did happen in terms of a map. So here is what those temperature departures were over this 5-day period, and we do see extensive cold centered in the central and south central U.S. Departures -15 plus. I know forecasting for Cheyenne, we saw that cold air start to move in even before this period. But I was forecasting for the Weather Challenge, and they have had these persistent snowy events out there in the high plains. That's consistent with this very cold temperatures, negative temperature departures. A little bit of above normal along the East Coast, but not enough to outweigh all of this cold that we saw over this 5-day period. Looking at what the height anomalies were associated with this cold, we do see the largest anomaly is this positive height anomaly south of Alaska, and then combined with the negative height anomaly over the Great Lakes, you would infer some anomalous northerly flow pouring into the western and central U.S. in support of those cold temperatures. So as always, I just try to turn the CPC forecast into a number, and so you can see my interpretation of the CPC forecast at the time was for some above normal temperatures, giving below normal HDDs. And if I can, there we go back to, here was that CPC forecast, the most recent one leading up to this period, and we see essentially the opposite of what actually happened. We have the above normal forecast right in this area that was very cold. I guess a little bit affected from Louisiana was in agreement with cold air, but then you don't really see that warmth along the East Coast either. And interestingly, when you go through the discussion from CPC, they indicated that the uncertainty was high for this particular forecast. It's the autumnal transition season, so I guess they feel that's inherently an uncertain time to be forecasting 3 or 4 weeks out. They noted a weak MJO, stuck in phase 1. There's Indian Ocean dipole doing something, but overall low tropical activity is what they saw when they were making their forecast a few days before we made ours. But the one thing I noticed was we had the big typhoon affecting Japan at this time, and they indicated that could have big impacts on downstream predictability into our region. They also noted poor agreement between the various models. So when I go to the MJO, just to show how has it evolved recently, we do see it was here in phase 1 at the time of the forecast. It did have this little spike into phase 2, and then during this period, it was fairly weak, although it's been shifting over to phase 5. Now, I don't have what the forecast distribution looked like back on the 15th. The closest I could find was here's the verification starting from the 21st. And we do see at least this later forecast seems to be pretty accurate, although it's not capturing the current phase 5 state quite as well. This is looking only at the GEFS, not the European, which isn't on this particular website. But the other thing I noticed was there's this region of, for the 500 millibar heights at least, right around the time we were making our forecasts, there was rather poor, those particular numerical models didn't do so good of a job, at least for the 11 to 15 day period leading up to the period we were actually forecasting for. Perhaps that drop in the scores here has to do with that recurving typhoon, leading to poor predictability in this time frame. Looking at some of the other roles, no one really mentioned, I guess, was it Mike maybe that mentioned teleconnections, right? So I go to these teleconnections, in particular the P&A, what I noticed was, I don't know why I'm pointing here, I should use my mouse. I noticed, during this period, the verification was negative P&A, but the 14-day forecast, again, leading up right ahead of when we were making our forecast, was close to 0 for the mean, and quite a bit of spread, as is typically the case for this time frame. So we definitely are on the low end of this envelope P&A forecast, again, based on the GEFS, I think these lines come from. And so negative P&A, according to the Dynacast tool, does indicate these cold anomalies not as severe as what was observed. But so if I'm interpreting this right, I just plugged in, show me the P&A analogs based on what the actual conditions were during this period. And we do see the cold temperatures and it's associated with that ridging over the Pacific Ocean with positive P&A pattern, and even some of the warmth along the East Coast that was observed. And I just made sure that this year, 2019, didn't show up as an analog. So using past years, doing whatever magic Dynacast does to come up with these numbers. So the P&A does seem to be, if that was predictable, 3 weeks in advance, it seems like keying in on the P&A may have been a key factor to coming up with what actually happened over this past 5-day period that we were forecasting for. So that is what I found in terms of what went into the cold weather we experienced over this particular period. I don't know if anyone else has additional comments. I can stop sharing my screen if you have something up you want to show regarding what happened during this most recent verification period.
Matt or Jason, I'm curious if you guys have any insight into this.
I'll bite first since Matt gets to talk on the floor later. Yeah, I think a very interesting pattern evolutionary period. I really liked the notion of late October, early November cold risk evolving potentially polar origin and affecting more of the western half of the nation first. I think the shift in convective forcing was very important. Late October and early November, low AAM MJO phase 1, or the Western IO, Eastern African region, those composites are not cold, and leaking convective forcing into more of the Western IO with low AAM for an MJO2 composite in November is also not cold. It's more zonal wave train with short wavelengths, and it's not amplified enough to displace cold air even into the west in the composite setting. So that I think set up the previous warm look, and then shifting out of that was very key. So the additional eastward propagation of convective forcing, along with, I believe, some impacts enhancing some of the jet streak extensions across the northern Pacific from the recurving typhoons. Not every recurving typhoon is a cold signal. It definitely depends on the antecedent conditions of the western Pacific pattern and the North Pacific jet. But in this case, I think a pair of typhoons actually did a number on injecting some additional amplitude into the Pacific pattern, along with bumping AAM a little bit higher on the heels of losing the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asian monsoon systems. So getting AAM up out of the gutter, getting a couple of recurving pack typhoons, and getting out of MJO 1-2 with low AAM, I think all combined very nicely to really amplify the eastern half of the Pacific pattern. Thereafter, I think it was, it's short, late October, early November wavelengths. If you're going to have a ton of amplification at that period, it's really hard to get the cold into the eastern U.S. first. You're going to probably deliver it into the west, and so playing the short autumnal wavelengths, I think, was really key there, and hammering the west and central first. Otherwise, this 92 number could have been off the freaking charts if you'd have involved more of the I-95 corridor. But that's my take. A mixture of shifting convective forcing, AAM still on the slight negative side, but up closer to neutral, and some jet streak extension plus enhanced amplitude from some tropical cyclone recurve effects for this particular period.
All right. Thanks for those comments. Does anyone else have any thoughts on this most recent period?
I guess, Professor Decker, could you, I wonder, you had the Maxar 16 to 20 report up. I wonder if you could pull up their 16 to 20.
The current report.
Yeah, exactly. Could you, if you go to the page before this, like their, you can pull up their 16 to 20 from October 15th. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, exactly. And then you could just change the date up there to, yeah, right up there, October. And then we could just see what they were showing. I guess before we shift gears, and we shift gears whenever Professor Decker is ready, but one of the points that Professor Decker brought up was how even like, and by the way, let me just full disclosure, my forecast was one of the worst here, so full disclosure. But like even when I look at the radiant map here, who from an HD, one of the things we've talked about in terms of learning that's been suggested several times is, hey, we should ask participants not just to put a number, but to try to create a map. So that, because in some cases you're right for the wrong reasons, and et cetera. And ultimately, this is a learning process, right? And so, like when I look at the radiant or Maxar map here, it's like from an HDD perspective, they were a little bit closer, I think, than some. I think that's what Professor Decker brought up. Yeah, exactly. But from a pattern perspective, I mean, it's like it's tough, right? I mean, they accentuated the cold along the East Coast, and that was like the one area that was actually warm and had pretty warm west. So, again, when you look at this more broadly, again, full disclosure, my forecast was terrible. So, but you wonder if they got it closer, not that it was a great forecast, but closer for the right reasons, or that it just lucked out. And the other point I wanted to bring up here was we also talk about a lot of forecast risk, right? We talk, well, maybe they were hinting or something. When I read the forecast risk, they did, for the eastern United States, they did mention a little bit. Well, they kind of said warmer risks from the Midwest toward the east, so they were kind of more Midwest, which, okay, but let's say that was split. And then they said the Southwest could also be warmer. So, if anything, they were thinking that the risks for the West were even warmer. So, especially for the central and western United States, or, it was like completely, I mean, they didn't even see it coming. And so I guess there's a question, there's also sort of just a general question too, and this even goes back to what Jason said, I wonder after looking at all this, would you do anything differently? So I understand, like, okay, Jason brought up a couple of things. Like, one, this could be in part attributed to the West Pacific activity. On the other hand, it doesn't always happen this way. And I think, and then we had Matt Rogers last week, who also said, a lot of times there could be forecasts In his experience, there's maybe more uncertainty with Westpac activity, but you don't always know where. And this was a perfect case. I think he even said, like, sometimes, a lot of times he's noticed that you get bigger troughs, but you don't know if they're going to be in the east, the central, or the west. And of course, this time it was west and central, most of the United States. So I guess my question back to everyone is, knowing what you know now, if the situation, I mean, how would you better try to resolve this situation? It's easy to say, I would just go colder or whatever, but would you really go colder if this exact setup happened again? Would you try to adjust your risk, maybe inflate your risks somewhat? I don't know, just some thoughts and comments.
I think the tough part, just trying to remember, if you go back to what we all actually forecasted, I don't believe anybody, no metric we had, no person seemed to capture the cold. So it's kind of hard for us to really get to, like, the EC didn't have it, the CFS didn't have it, our analog, our moving averages, nothing had it. So I don't even know if there was any clear indication that it was going to be so off.
Yeah. By the way, I joked to that. It's funny. I joked to someone else. I forgot this was offline. But all summer long, we were talking about how the CFS was like a broken record, cold, 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 almost colder than everything, right? And most of the time it was wrong. Like there were 2 times in the summer. So this forecast, it actually like super warm, like one of the warmest forecasts out here. And of course, it goes in the opposite direction. But you can't try to be that bad. I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Any other comments on this
One
forecast
thing-
before you-
One thing I'll mention is I think if the forecast for the P&A had been more accurate, since it did verify significantly more negative than the forecast, I think knowing and seeing the analog years that Dr. Decker showed, I think that might have been something that might have changed at least my forecast. Because I looked at the P&A for that, obviously, and I noted that there could be a slightly negative risk to it, but not anything as negative as it ended up going. So that influenced my forecast to, even though I was one of the better forecasters for this week, my map would have looked something similar to the Maxar forecast. So right for the wrong reason, I suppose. But the P&A forecast, I think, would have, if it had been more accurate, I think would have made more of a difference, at least in my forecast.
So I'll piggyback on the heels of that. I think the P&A has virtually zero predictive look-ahead value. I think it's good for trying to characterize the flavor of the pattern, but has no roll-forward predictability attached to it. So, I kind of look at the P&A as a lag zero only. The Pacific, high latitude Pacific and the rest of the high latitude, blocking related indices, I think have more predictive / durable or extendable value. And looking back at the EPO and the WPO, for instance, those both verified substantially more negative than forecasts at 11-15 timeframes from all of the model ensemble means. You're probably getting some ensemble mean averaging, weakening the signal there. But playing a more aggressive negative EPO, negative WPO, suggesting that you are actually going to tap polar air. I mean, I think the majority of us industry guys, if you show us that pattern and tell us the first cold's going to come into the west and central and the east coast is going to be warm, we're not going anywhere near 90 HDDs for the period. You got to have polar origin air to do that if you're not going to involve the east coast, especially if you're going to have the east coast above normal. And the only way you're going to get polar origin air in this situation is to go short wavelengths and substantial, full latitude, damn near full latitude blocking or ridging in the Eastern Pacific or up the west coast of North America. So, in the hindsight 2020 approach, if you can take a perfect prog sort of view, then the more negative EPO, more negative WPO responding to some of these more physical process stimuli that we talked about with the potential enhancement effects from the tropical cyclones and the shift to convective forcing. I think those would have been the canaries in the coal mine that, hey, you're going to have to go colder with this. This isn't, North Pacific origin air. This is stuff that came straight out of the, Nunavut, it originated over the continent. This is continental polar / Arctic air, and it didn't have to deal with the moderation risk over the exposed warmer than normal SSTs at the higher latitudes.
Yeah, it's a good point about the avoiding those. I think last I looked, there was still some record low or close to record low sea ice up there, so avoiding that is a good point. Any other comments on the past event here before we move to our current forecasts?
We'll have more time next week to complain about the underestimation of the cold, so to be continued.
All right, so we have, I guess maybe I'll sort this by coldest forecast to warmest forecast. And I'll go first because I'm here at one of the warmer forecasts, because as usual, I'm just following the CPC guidance, and we see a lot of warmth in the CPC forecast, with the exception of the Great Lakes and New England. We have above normal in the forecast. It is for many areas only slightly positive departures here, between 50 and 55% probability, so not extreme high probabilities of warmth, but it is above normal is the forecast. So that is why my forecast is for slightly below climatology in terms of the HDDs. I did bump up my spread a little bit to account for it is a big change from what's going on right now. And so I increased my spread a little bit over at least one of the climatological spreads that I was looking at, maybe the 30-day moving average. So that is my forecast. Does anyone have any questions about that? Again, I don't really try to do my own forecast. I'm trying to make sort of a benchmark comparison, since we don't have CPC as one of our forecasts here, but this product exists, so I put it out there just as a comparison. I tend to turn it into a number, or two numbers, really.
Were there any interesting takeaways from the CPC discussion?
Let's take a look at that. So if I go to the discussion, we see they're combining all of these different models together. They also considered anomalous snow cover, which is interesting because I think I saw that's above normal, right?
Yep.
And yet I wouldn't associate above normal snow cover with forecast of warmth. But maybe that means it would have been even warmer a forecast if they didn't account for the snow cover, I suppose. They mentioned the MJO, but it's continuing to propagate towards the east, favoring a colder outcome. The confidence is tempered on how much influence the MJO actually exerts on those latitudes. They know it's currently way below normal, as we were just looking at, but the models are in good agreement that an upper level ridge will become established over western North America in the day or week 3 to 4 range. So they're expecting to flip from the positive height anomalies over the Gulf of Alaska. I think they noticed there should be now a trough, and there should be now a ridge over the west instead of the deep trough across the west and central. So they are expecting essentially a flip in the pattern from what's going on right now. I think mostly based on these model forecasts. That's my interpretation anyway.
Who wrote that? I'm just curious. This feels like they put this on.
Forecaster is CPC.
They used to find that name. The only reason I brought that up is because it almost feels like a different type discussion than the one you showed before.
Okay, yeah.
I just wonder why last time there was so little confidence, and this time they, there's a lot to dissect there. Just the fact that they're saying, hey, the models show good consistency weeks 3 and 4, when there's been such struggles with the models in projecting these things 10 or 15 days out. So what does that mean, in other words? I mean, does that mean high confidence because the models happen to show something 25 days out that's the same?
Here's that consistency.
Yeah, exactly. So they did there too. They were both consistently completely wrong.
Right. If we go back to the one that was consistent too. And this is the one from October that's completely wrong. And we do see that consistency again in the current forecast.
Maybe we could come back to that. I know we're supposed to be in our 2-minute drill, so but I think it's just, I don't know. Interesting.
And interestingly, the CFS again, CPC made their forecast on Friday. This is the current CFS, completely the opposite direction, and not consistent with
I
the
noticed
current
that.
ECW.
I noticed that. Yeah.
At least the way it's being portrayed here. Who would like to go next?
I guess I can go next. So my
Hey,
forecast.
Michael, is that you?
Yeah.
Okay, Mike. Let's try it for in particular for our student forecasters. Let's try to follow the script here. And Matt Lanza, this is an opportunity for you. You're Michael's client, right? And so we really want you to, at the end of this, feel free to jump in or even interrupt him. Like pretend you're the client on the call here, man. You don't have a lot of time. You need to get the information quickly. You need Michael to be pithy, and and if you don't get what you need, you're going to interrupt, and at the end, you're going to ask hard questions. I know it's difficult to put yourself in that situation, but we really want that for so the Michael and Zach here kind of get a feel for what it's like in the trenches and all.
Gotcha.
All right, cool. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, so hello everyone. My 16 to 20 day forecast is for 105.8 HDDs with a slightly over 1 sigma spread of 18 HDDs. This forecast of 105.8 HDDs is slightly colder than the 30-year normal, which is sitting at 104.5 HDDs. Now, this forecast is only slightly colder, which, as I'm sure most of you know by now, the last two forecasts look to be going to be verifying much colder than the 30-year normal and most of our forecasts, but we're confident that this week the forecast will not be such an extreme. Now, my forecast was a blend of 60% of teleconnections, 30% of the CPC forecast, and 10% of the 10-year. The main feature that stuck out to me on using these metrics was the fairly negative AO, I believe 2 sigma below the 0 point on the AO, sorry. So I'm expecting some cold based on that signal, as well as some others. Some risks for the forecast: if the AO does not verify as negative as it's showing, the verification has been fairly good these past couple of weeks. It hasn't been verifying overly positive based on the forecasts, but that is a risk if it doesn't verify negative. It's also possible that I'm too warm and it verifies too cold. So the AO could be a huge risk here. The PNA and NAO, they're showing around the neutral area. So those, if either of those go to positive or negative, those could also influence where we see the cold rather than the cold itself. Another risk is if the comes from the CPC forecast. They're forecasting a lot of warmth. That would obviously goes against my forecast. Sorry. So that's another risk to the forecast. But again, I'm confident in my forecast at this time. Are there any questions that I can address or any concerns that I might have missed?
Hey, Michael. So if you had to pick, based on what you're hearing, what you're saying, I'm gathering that if you're leaning one way or the other relative to where your forecast is right now, you're leaning toward the colder side. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So you would expect it to be colder than when you would expect the risk to be skewed higher to the cold side.
Yeah.
Okay. That's what I want to know. And I'll just say that I asked that question because that's the kind of question I get a lot from people. It's like, okay, that's great. You're telling me your forecast. Where's the risk? And that's what I'm often tasked with answering.
Yeah, I could see that.
All right. Thanks, Mike, for your forecast. I guess let's stick with the students. And Zach, you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My forecast for the window of November 20th to the 24th is for 107 HDDs with a spread of 16.6 HDDs. My forecast is slightly colder than the 30-year of 104.5 HDDs. So my scheme uses a combination of the 30-year, the CPC, the EC, and CFS. And looking at those, I believe the main takeaway is the presence of a ridge in the west and a trough in the east. And this trough is in the eastern U.S. over many population centers, so that's driving my slightly cooler than normal forecast. I do see some risk in this forecast, however, and it does involve the trough that I just mentioned. The EC and the CPC don't seem to resolve one very well. They're keeping mostly they seem to resolve the ridge in the west very well with above normal warmth, but don't really seem to show much going on in the eastern U.S. But the CFS does, and it's quite strong. And the CPC also mentioned the potential for one to occur. So that leads me to think that there's potentially some uncertainty on whether or not it's going to appear or not. And I also know, based on experience in the last few weeks, that the EC seems to have trouble resolving the troughs. It gets the ridges well, or gets the ridges correct, but doesn't seem to resolve the troughs well. So the uncertainty is whether or not this will appear, but because it seems to be a mix of having one and not having one, my confidence in that there will be one is there. It's just I don't believe it's going to be as cold as the CFS predicts it's going to be, leading me to a colder than normal forecast, but not as cold as the 130 HDDs the CFS is forecasting. So does anybody have any questions?
Real quick, I'll fire one away. So in this weather climate regime with the relatively short wavelengths and the demonstrated ability to source continental polar air, if you've got solid aboves in the west, how do you avoid pretty high quality boundary layer cold air coming south into the U.S. east of the Rockies?
So you're asking whether, based on the pattern in the west, is there potential for colder than normal temperatures to propagate into the east? Is that what you're asking?
Correct. It would confuse an end user a little bit to see higher confidence or higher amplitude, stronger anomalies in the west without some kind of not exactly offsetting or equal anomalies in the opposite sign downstream, but since late October, we've been able to tap some pretty darn good cold air anytime you go with Western North American ridging. And so that's one thing that bothers me about the CPC forecast. If you've got plenty of aboves out west and that's the highest confidence area, that looks woefully too warm to me to the Midwest and East. You're going to have to lengthen wavelengths in order to deflect cold air from not getting into the Ohio Valley or Mid-Atlantic. Is there a way to do that? I just trying to see if there's some kind of physical consistency in the view between strong warmth in the west and not as strong of cold in the east as we've seen.
Yeah, that's one of the things, and you had kind of mentioned it as well, that it was concerning that the CPC seemed to show all of this high confidence warmth in the west, but nothing really in the east. And from a physical sense, you'd expect a trough downstream from a ridge. So that's again why I kept my value colder than normal, because I did expect that pattern to exist, even though some of these metrics weren't really showing it.
Yeah, like that right there, that requires, in my opinion, a much more extended Pacific jet or an active subtropical Pacific jet, one you would find with a higher background AAM. And there's no indications of higher background AAM on any of the guidance that I have seen. So
I'll just chime in just to kind of echo what Jason's saying. I think it's kind of interesting, almost comical actually, with the CPC thing is, that this map was made on Friday and how much has changed since Friday just in the medium range modeling that would, potentially argue for, even more of what Jason's point, to Jason's point here. So I think that's there's been a lot of change just in the last 3 or 4 days. Relative to everything that we've seen, it seems to all generally want to point colder in the east.
All right. Let's see. Input number 1. Would you like to explain your forecast?
Yeah, I don't. I'm not going to follow that script, but for me. But the long story short is I continue to adjust my formula toward the 30-year normal. This is something I've talked about doing for the last few weeks as we get to winter versus summer. And the other point I'll make that's probably relevant, long story short, is based on the various MJO metrics and this, that, the other thing that I investigated, I didn't feel like there was a strong enough signal to adjust my numbers significantly warmer or colder. There were some just mixed data points. For example, our MJO analog here, you can see that Dr. Decker helped develop, is very warm, relatively warm anyway. But I felt like there were also some other data points, maybe it was Paul Roundy's, that was a little bit cooler than that. So I didn't see a strong signal there. I don't feel like I have a strong handle on what drove this cold pattern, nor do I, and since I don't feel like I have a good handle on whether I can say it's going to be persistent or not. And I know if I just look at statistical persistence tools, they've generally sucked. In other words, that they haven't been very skillful in terms of, hey, it's been cold the last 10 days or 15 days, and to try to use that as a predictor. Yeah. So we've actually started to look at some of these things. And the reason in some cases why these things are so bad is, well, we were just talking about this before the call. We just came out of a period in September where we had like 4 weeks where it was incredibly warm, much warmer than all our forecasts for like 4 weeks in a row. And so the persistence starts to pick up on that. And then, of course, we go into an opposite pattern and it gets destroyed. So anyway, it hasn't worked that well. So that's how I came up sort of with my number today.
I can get back to our forecast. So I guess, Matt, would you like to discuss your forecasting?
All right, so I'm the big bull this week, going 115 HDDs relative to the 30-year normal of 105, 10-year normal 101. My main thinking right now is that I'm shifting toward using more of a 30-year base at this point, just because of how cold we have been, and going to kind of start with that. Regarding MJO, and just looking at some of the plots, I don't feel confident using it at this point in my forecast too substantially, just because it looks like I feel like there's a little bit of noise in there and a little bit of convection in a couple different places that could impact the forecast one way or the other. So, that's not to say that it's not going to be a significant driver within the period, but just for my personal forecasting, I don't feel confident using it right now. And I haven't had, too much confidence in that in the last couple of days. So 30-year normal, mixed signals MJO, in my view. I've been using day 15 extrapolation lately to some degree of success. What is interesting is that every time it looks like we're going to start to warm up, toward the back end of the period, that tends to disappear. I feel like the last time I saw this with any sort of frequency like this was back in the winter of 13, 14, where I felt like every time we had an ability to warm up, sometimes we did, but it was quick, short-lived, and disappeared. And in that winter, we ended up going back with stronger signals toward cold. And I feel like we're sort of in that pattern right now. where, you know, every time it looks like we're going to start to warm up, that disappears after a couple of days, or whatever it is short-lived. But that being said, there's still some signals that we could, you know, end up seeing a little bit of a brief warm-up in there. So despite the cold forecast, there's definitely some risk to the downside here, you know, with a little bit of, you know, if you get a little bit of extension of the pack jet, moving some warmer air inland across the western U.S. into the central U.S., you know, shifting the trough a little bit to the east of the East Coast, a little bit less cold in the east. So with that in mind, also looking at the Euro weeklies from yesterday, you know, just to get a sense as to what the upper air pattern was showing, and they tend to continue to show this west coast to Alaska type ridging scenario that can, you know, drop in some cold into the central and eastern U.S. So just based on how things have been going lately for me, you know, it's starting with the 30-year normal and then adding, you know, a few HDDs just for my own personal bias where I have not been cold enough in the extended range for now. And it's one of those things that, you know, persistence only works until it doesn't. And, you know, we're sort of in that phase where I feel like being somewhat persistent in the forecast is the way to go for now, though I think that may start to change as we go toward later November and into early December, when I'm starting to worry that we'll see some relaxation. But in the meantime, so 115, but a pretty big spread, 20, you know, that goes both ways. I would skew toward the colder side right now, but there is definitely a non-zero chance of a warmer outcome here that could be substantially less than what is forecast, perhaps in the 90s to near 100 for HDDs for that 16 to 20 day period. If we get some of that extension from the Pacific into the West Coast, and, you know, migrate some of that PNA ridging from the West Coast into the central U.S. So all in all, cold, but yeah, a lot of uncertainty. November's a lot of fun.
Well, I disagree with the confidence of the Maxar forecast, right? A lot of these regions are marketed, so they're indicating with confidence, although they didn't really say why. I don't think the confidence was lower. They just say it's lower. Maybe because they're going so much against the models in their forecast, I suppose.
Yeah. Hey, Dr. Decker, can we look at one thing based on Matt's? I thought Matt and Jason alluded to this too. Can we look at the EC 16 to 20? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. The actual, yeah, models, and then climate up top, climate to the right, yeah. And then if you wouldn't mind, first starting with the 500 millibar height anomaly. Yep. And then if you could switch to the global view maybe. Yeah, right there. And then if you can go down to the 16 to 20. Yeah, there we go. And then,
all right, so there's that map, right? And then now can you go to the toggle to the like surface temperature anomalies? Yeah, exactly. And start from the 1 to 5 and just like slowly go 1 to 5, 6, 10, 11 to 15. Start off how cold it is. And then 6 to 10, still pretty darn cold. 11 to 15, cold but not as 16 to 20. So my point is what Matt brought up kind of about the extrapolation from the 11 to 15. If you, and Jason alluded to this too, I think with his question to Zach. If you believe that the pattern is going to, if the EC pattern is just about right, the 500 millibar height pattern, if I believe that, if I knew it was going to be just basically spot on, I would bet the house too that it's going to verify a lot colder at the surface, because that dilution of cold from the 1 to 5 to the 6 to 10 to the 16 to 20 without a major change in the jet stream pattern just looks, I mean, again, this is, I'm saying this subjectively and from experience. I'd love to better quantify this, and I think there might be ways we could do that. But subjectively, experientially speaking, it looks like BS to me. And like, how are you going to lose from the 6 to 10 to the 16 to 20? How are you going to lose that much cold air without a fundamental shift to the jet stream pattern? And I think that's, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but I think you were kind of alluding a little bit to something like that in terms of why, you know, it makes sense, or you believe that you should be a little bit colder than the EC and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, if I'm going to use this tool, I'm not going to use it verbatim. I'm going to take what I think are hints and try and figure out, okay, well, what is going to be the big, what's going to be the big signal here? And to me, looking at the 500 millibar map from this, the largest, at least relative to U.S. signal temporarily looks like, ridging off the Pac Northwest, Southwest Canada kind of deal. That's not necessarily showing a ridge per se, but it's got enough higher height anomalies there that to me, that's something that I'm going to buy into at least a little bit. Now there's other things that can wreck that, of course, but overall, to me, that's a signal that I'm not going to completely ignore.
So I'm bothered a bit, but now that you have that the 500 millibar height anomaly plot up there for the 16 to 20 from the Euro climate model ensemble mean, I'm a little bit bothered in the fact that it thinks we can, completely wreck the negative WPO that fast. I'm fine with that red noise ridge migrating maybe a little bit northwest or poleward from there, but I don't know that we're going to replace it with this massive Bering Strait trough that fast. So that's a concern. I'm also a little bit concerned about the lack of positive height anomalies nosing their way back through Greenland. So I guess I think there are some dynamical corrections that could be made that bolster this point even more. That if you're going to have more western ridging, you're going to have a little bit more high latitude positive height anomalies somewhere bookending North America. There's probably more support for a deeper mean trough in the plains, Midwest, maybe a little bit farther east than that. The other thing I like, and oddly enough, my number's really close to Lanza's. I would be like in the mid to upper one teens with a 1.5 sigma kind of spread. I think there's a little bit of Typhoon Halong effects here from the 6 to 10 into the 11 to 15 as well that can linger into the 16 to 20. I think that can inject a little bit more amplitude than ensemble means are seeing. It's essentially Halong's wave packet that is the seedling for the trough axis. It's moving through the Rockies and Plains at the end of the Euro ensemble 11 to 15. And that's going to be the seedling, in nascent trough that if we're going to be right on this colder than normal idea, that's the trough that's going to do it. And usually, we've seen more amplitude in the 11 to 15 periods roll forward when these events have occurred in a generally favorable synoptic background.
So I guess maybe this European, say 16 to 20, shows one possible answer to how can you have a big ridge in the west and not get too much cold in the east, and it looks like we have a pretty good positive NAO going on here with strong westerly winds, maybe shunting all that cold air towards the North Atlantic, and said if this forecast were correct. I don't know how predictable that is.
Right. Well, I was just going to say, I agree. I totally, right? So that kind of looks like the CPC. You see where the CPC gets their thing, and that's kind of like a flattish ridge across the country. But yeah, speaking of the NAO, right? I know, well, obviously that, I think just, again, this is more just experiential, but NAO predictability, especially again, the 1620 is very problematic. And I think even one of our other forecasters, I think it was Paul Roundy, in his discussion, I've read that today, and I think he, it might have been his, was it today? Yeah, he mentions that some of his statistical models suggest that we could see just the opposite, growing high latitude block in eastern Canada and Greenland. So be careful. Well, according to Paul, his stuff.
Any other comments on the forecast?
The only other thing I was going to bring up real quick, because it's been brought up a couple times, just to play devil's advocate on the other side, right? The negative PNA and all this kind of stuff that's been brought up
talked about, and even go back to last week or 2 weeks, whatever it was, with Matt Rogers. Part of this is a research exercise, and part of this is practical for this forecast. If we do get more of a negative PNA, and Jason, I think, alluded to this. I know in this case it worked out that it was super cold, right? Because it just covered like 80% of the country, 90 with cold. But also there's a lot of cases where that doesn't happen, and the gradient sets up a little bit further west, and you get a little bit more of those big eastern cities, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, whatever, deeper into the warmth. And you end up, even though 2/3 of the country is blue, you still have below normal demand, or at least normal, or slightly below normal. So I do wonder if that's a risk here, and a justification, which some of you guys did, to go with, even if you're on the cold side, to have a bigger spread, because even if we get the PNA, negative PNA, maybe this time it sets up just a little bit further to the west. And even, you know, and so we end up with a much different HDD outcome.
Yeah. So I think the way out is the more extended pack jet. If you look at the day 15 off the Euro ensemble, the thing that scares me the most is, as a snapshot, you got a nice extended north pack jet with the exhaust region just west of the west coast, so you're going to get the wave breaking there, and AAM's not in the gutter, so it's, you know, going to be neutrally or negatively tilted. And that's helping build ridging up the west coast or near the west coast of North America. So you start with a positive PNA, and that has a potential to evolve into a negative EPO and tap higher quality cold air if you leave it like that for a little while longer. If that damn Pacific jet keeps trucking along and the extension continues farther east to the Gulf of Alaska, you know, Matt mentioned this in his forecast as a potential risk, or a reason to not get carried away with the cold. I think that's the way out of cold. If you look at, you know, more like the northern hemispheric view with the 500 millibar height anomalies, that extended jet could come farther east and essentially, you know, to oversimplify, nudge features too far east, and then, you know, maybe flood more of the U.S. with mid-latitude Pacific air, which anything that's not active cold advection will be warmer than ensemble means, I think.
Last question for you guys on this, just because Dr. Decker is going through some of these graphics. I know there's talk about a snowstorm or potential, what have you, day 5, 6 or so. Any risks there that you guys see? Any unusual risks, like beyond normal type risks, that could also have an impact in that area that the models may not well resolve right now?
I'll bite and say that, yeah, that's always a risk. You know, you just don't know until you see it happen, and sometimes it'll be a, you know, 2 or 3 days before the event where you start to see those changes begin to metastasize, you know, the high latitudes off the East Coast. So it's definitely a risk, but I feel like there's so much going on right now on the west side from the pack that, you know, I don't want to say it's noise per se, but at this point, to me, in my own personal forecasting, it's noise.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's Friday.
There it is. Yeah, sorry. So, okay, fair enough. Anything on your end, Jason? Anything get, you know, your spidey sense, anything there? Or just?
Well, you know, the jet, I mentioned the jet extension is the way out to the warm side I see risk-wise, and that's been hard to do. You know, wavelengths have been quite short, so that's, I guess, that undermines my risk statement and would fuel more confidence. You know, models' ability to handle high latitude ridging beyond 11 to 15 right now, or late 11 to 15 that rolls forward, has been disappointing. I don't want to say that we're, you know, seeing direct effects of the grand solar minimum just yet, but this negative WPO projection and red noise ridge feature was a hell of a lot stronger and more durable than any model has suggested in the last 2 weeks. Even though the NAO projection looks positive in all the the computed index values, there's ridging nosing across Greenland and effectively helping to lock the PV lobe in eastern Canada. So that hasn't been handled well from an index perspective. So I guess I'd have a healthy distrust of high latitude index values that are supposed to find ridging. They may weaken too fast or give you the wrong damn sign outright.
Thank you. Hey, Matt, since everyone's quiet, one more, I'm going to put you on the spot. You teased something about 2013-14 earlier when you were comparing, you were making the point about how the model's kind of suggesting a warming, but it never comes forward. Anything you want to say there in terms of, extrapolating that out toward this winter? Are you seeing some signs here that we could be looking for that, or is it too early to say?
I think it's too early to say, but it's definitely on my radar. Just in terms of less so from an actual forecasting standpoint, though I guess from an actual forecasting standpoint it'd be helpful, but more from a sitting on the trade floor and giving my traders potential risks to what can happen here. I distinctly remember in 13-14 how many times it was like, you would have one change over 2 to 3 consecutive model runs that would be move to the warmer side, and then all of a sudden it would just come crashing right back down colder as you were you go out a little bit the next couple of days subsequent to that. So it was almost like predictable in the sense that, okay, well, once the models start going warm, that's a good buying opportunity to get back in for when they go cold again. And this is something I've thought about, and I don't know what it feels like a kind of a voodoo type thing to me, but it's just one of those things that you deal with in your experience that sort of sticks with you and you're watching out for constantly. And having seen the hints of that already this October and now into the first couple of days of November, it's something that I'm going to be watching pretty closely. And that okay, once we start to go warmer, when is there going to be that risk that all of a sudden we flip back cold again? And that's going to stick with me now until something changes otherwise. But I just wonder if there's something about these types of large scale setups, these types of winters that models struggle to resolve more so than usual. I don't know the mechanics of that, what that looks like, but it's just something that sits in the back of my mind that I wonder about.
Thank you.
Well, we've essentially reached 12 o'clock. Are there any final questions, comments about the forecast or anything else we've discussed today? All right, I guess that wraps up today's discussion. Thank you all for participating.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, guys. Everyone.
See you guys. See you, Lanza.
Take care, man. Bye all.
Bye, guys.
Bye.